Ja, velkommen tilbake etter pausa. Navnet mitt Knut Ove Eliassen. Til daglig professor I litteraturvitenskap på NTNU. Grunnen til at jeg står her at jeg også en del av støtteapparatet rundt denne konferansen. Og det her prosjektet, digital kultur og estetisk praksis, det vil si en medlem av forsknings- og utviklingsutvalget I Kulturrådet. Men I alle fall, det her skal ikke handle om undertegnede, det skal I første omgang handle om Nanna Bonde Thylstrup, som universitetslektor, det vil si førsteamanuensis, ved Copenhagen Business School, det som het København Handelshøyskole I gamle dager, ved Department of Management, Society and Communication. Så det skulle med andre være spot on I forhold til vårt tema. Nanna har arbeidet I flere år med emner som big data, elektroniske arkiver, med mere, og forfatter av dette flotte bindet som kom ut tidligere I år på MIT, The Politics of Mass Digitisation. Nok en bok I vente på MIT, så det åpenbart at Nanna helt I forskningsfronten. Vi får en rapport sendt tilbake herifra de fremste linjene, og den neste boka vil handle om Uncertain Archives. I dag skal Nanna snakke om Mass Digitisation and the Politics of Infrastructure. And without further ado, fordi Nanna foretrekker å snakke på engelsk, så gir jeg ordet til deg. Vær så god, Nanna. Det vidunderlig å ha deg her.
Ja, tusen takk. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the wonderful introduction, Knut Ove. I'm really happy to be here. Thrilled to have already heard such excellent presentations, and I look forward to hearing the forefront of Norwegian research in this exciting field later on as well. So I, in my book, so much for electronic literature, Scott. In my book, have been looking at the politics of mass digitization, and my talk will briefly go into what I mean by that. But first, I want to start with this picture. So I wonder if anyone can tell what is going on here. Yes. Yes. So this wonderful lady is ironing newspapers. So all newspapers in the British Library were ironed before they were microfilmed to ensure a clear image. And we see a staff member ironing a paper. And we will never know the name of this woman, but her work is instrumental to what we see when we go online in what are now massive databases of literature, among other things. So this woman with her ironing board is far removed from the interfaces of mass digitized spaces that we are most familiar with. Indeed, these mass digitized spaces are overflowing sites of content, books, images, and sounds, to name but a few. Here we see the tiny irony. I really love these instruments. While few of us know the immense labor that goes into creating these knowledge spaces, and while we rarely understand how these sites have come to be, many of us now rely on their infrastructures for our daily work as we frantically search for citations and look up new literature. In this reliance, we're quietly changing our habits of reading, writing, and even remembering. So my book is trying to grapple with these changes, as well as offering historical contextualization of these interfaces that are often devoid of historicization. So indeed, my book seeks to understand mass digitization and its place in digital culture, asking questions such as, how did mass digitization become a moral imperative? We have to mass digitize. Why do we digitize on a massive scale? And what are the political logics governing these mass digitization projects? And what new ethical and political questions do they give rise to? So the basic premise of the book is that mass digitization is a political phenomenon that ties together local, national, and global infrastructures in ways that both work in continuation of as well as profoundly alter the politics of cultural memory. We see here Nefertiti, I'll return to her later on, waiting to be 3D scanned. When I started out writing my book, however, and that's a long time ago, too long, the predominant mode of speaking about mass digitization was in technical terms. Either questions revolved around technological innovations that would enable us to bring cultural heritage online, or the technicalities around copyright problems of doing so. So this is a patent, an image from a patent taken by Google, and it shows how you can effectively scan books. And for those interested in music, music is a part of this patent. Yet as political practice, however, mass digitization raises significant political questions. So what works, for instance, and institutions should be selected, and how should they be represented? So this is Google Books partner institutions. So I was also interested in what infrastructures that should uphold them, and what rights should the author and the user have. So one of the types of mass digitization projects I look at are shadow libraries. So a raise of hands, how many people use shadow libraries? What? One! That's amazing. All right. So I told my husband about it. He's also an academic, but in the field of law. And I told him about shadow libraries. So would you, if I said, how many use pirate libraries? Still only one. So I told him of the existence of this, and he immediately looked up his own name, and he was very pleased to find his books there because he was flattered of the interest. And so I also looked up my book, and here it is in Monoscope. That's one of the libraries I look at. So available for download or buying at MIT. So what I found so fascinating about mass digitization is that on the one hand, they're driven by classic cultural heritage institutional motivations, the archival drive to collect, preserve, accumulate, and organize knowledge. But on the other hand, they're also motivated by that much newer logic invariably understood as big data, culturonomics. Indeed, we might speak of big data, the gold rush of that, in the field of cultural memory. So often big data is driven by a non-situated discourse premised on the idea that data just magically appears online. Yet, as anyone who's ever been involved in mass digitization projects know, or even just scanned chapters for a compendium, digitizing books is a very intimate and a laborious affair, both on the corporeal level of scanning, and so this is one of my favorite blogs that's called The Art of Google Books, that collect scanning errors on Google Books. But it's also massive labor on the level of institution. As the ideal of mass digitization filters into different global empirical situations, this concept of mass digitization thus attains nuanced political hues. While all projects formally seek to serve the public interest in terms of access, for instance, providing access, preserving culture, they're in fact infused with much more diverse and often conflicting political and commercial motives and dynamics. So the same mass digitization project can even be imbued with different and contradictory investments. They can also change over time. Its purpose can change, its function can change, sometimes even rapidly. So mass digitization projects, I argue then, are highly political, but they're not political in the sense that they transfer the cultural politics of memory institutions on a one-to-one scale. They're also not political in the sense that they completely liberate objects from the traditional cultural memory politics. Rather, mass digitization presents a new political cultural memory paradigm, one in which we see strands of technical and ideological continuities combined with new ideals and possibilities. A political cultural memory paradigm that's arguably even more complex, or at least appears to us more messy now than that of analog institutions whose politics we've had some time getting used to. So in order to grasp the political stakes of mass digitization, therefore, we need to approach mass digitization projects not merely as a continuation of the existing politics of cultural memory, also not as purely technical endeavors, but rather as emerging phenomena that introduce new forms of cultural memory politics. So to gain insight into mass digitization and to make out its political contours, I suggest focusing on the material and social infrastructures, their territorial dimensions, and their power dynamics. So these cultural material entanglements, as Donna Haraway perhaps would call them, show us that while it's tempting to talk about specific mass digitization projects such as Google Books or Europeana in monolithic and contrastive terms, an infrastructural view allows us to see that mass digitization projects are anything but tightly organized, institutionally delineated, and coherent wholes that produce one dominant reading. We do not find one essence in mass digitization, nor are they rooted in one central location or single ideology. Rather, mass digitization projects are infrastructural in the political sense, that is, they're complex material and social infrastructures whose politics primarily take place at the level of infrastructure. Moreover, they're deeply entangled in what Lisa Lowy would call intimate relations between nations and continents. So to give an example, we can look at how the national and global aspects of cultural memory institutions both reproduce but also change with mass digitization. So the national museums and libraries we frequent today were largely erected during eras of high nationalism as supreme acts of cultural and national territoriality, even colonial territoriality. In some ways, these nationalizing efforts are also at the core of mass digitization projects. Indeed, I'll tell you now a little anecdote of how Europeana came to be, and it stars this gentleman, Jean-Noël Jeannenet. So in 2004, word came out through a Frankfurt Book Fair that Google Books were going to do a massive book scanning project. And Jean-Noël Jeannenet, who was then head of the National Library in France, reacted promptly, as a French would do, to say that this was an act of American colonization of French culture. And he wrote this little book, Quand Google défie l'Europe, plaidoyer pour un sursaut. It's been a while since I spoke French. This book is an aggression against Google, claiming that we need a European algorithm, a European algorithm in singular, and a European digitization project that can counter the colonizing forces of American commercial projects, because they would never be able to understand and even present European knowledge in the way that French logic would do, along the lines of Foucault. So he also promptly gave rise to a policy initiative, and now also a cultural project, here signed by Jacques Chirac and co-signatories of heads of European states, among others Silvio Berlusconi as well, Gerhard Schröder. And so this reply is a reply to France that, yes, this is a problem. We need to digitize in the European fashion. So when Europeana first launched, it looked like this. So this is a screen grab. And something happened right after launch. This happened. So it says the Europeana site is temporarily not accessible due to overwhelming interest after its launch, 10 million hits per hour. We're doing our utmost to reopen Europeana in a more robust version as soon as possible. We will be back by mid-December. So I asked, because I was like, what site gets that many visitors immediately after launching? Especially a little maybe, some of you probably don't even know today what Europeana is, right? So I talked to the people behind it, and they were like, well, it wasn't only increased interest. It was also because at the launch, they had made this little feature where when you made a search, you could see what the most popular searches. And so it would offer 3 most popular searches. And the 3 most popular searches in Europeana were related to porn and fascism. And so this was an unfortunate signal to send on behalf of Europe, that what we're most interested in our colonial cultural heritage is fascism and porn. So they immediately shut down the feedback structure. Yet the dichotomy between national and global is becoming more and more difficult to uphold in both theory and practice due to globalizing infrastructures such as new digital global platforms. Thus, mass digitization projects such as Google Books, Europeana, and DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America, while all linking to sovereign frameworks such as citizens and national representation, also still work to undermine them through late capitalist transnational economic agreements and social media forms of collaborations. So this is entering, for instance, Europeana through Facebook. And they can see in Europeana that most traffic goes through Facebook. Probably not anymore, but at the time that I talked to them, which creates a completely different situation for the user as well as Europeana itself and how it needs to navigate as both a European project that ensures its users a different kind, for instance, of privacy, and then also working with social media that will, of course, add cookies, and you know that drill. So a simple conclusion would be then to argue that mass digitization projects are post-national, post-sovereign. Yet, as I also argue in my book, they can't dispense with the sovereign frameworks either. Indeed, they're tied to questions of sovereignty at the root of their endeavors. Even Google, while globally distributed, still remains a preeminent US-based corporation subject to US laws and branded as an American corporation. So in addition, these mass digitization projects also unfolded into and actively reproduced the histories of sovereignty, including those tied to colonial histories and contemporary structural inequalities in the form, for instance, of racist characteristics. So this is a Google Arts app and the reactions on Twitter with people of color trying to use Google Art apps, finding that the training data for their faces is quite poor. So acknowledging the complex infrastructures of mass digitization, tied as they are to infrastructural arrangements that both undermine and reproduce sovereign imaginaries, gives us pause. So it allows us to understand that every time we say Google or Europeana, we need to reflect on what we actually mean. And it allows us to realize that we need to interrogate its entire compositions, its communities, practices, and infrastructures. And so what makes infrastructure central for understanding the politics of mass digitization? So primarily, they're crucial to understanding how industrialism has affected the ways in which we organize and engage with knowledge. But the politics of infrastructure is also becoming increasingly significant in our political landscape. So they're media of polities and politics, at times visible and at others, like the woman doing the ironing, barely legible or felt. They're also home to dissent as well as to standardizing and control measures. So this is one I just wanted to add for UC, one infrastructural take on library infrastructures by Samia Bomik, who's amazing. So often when thinking of infrastructures, we conceive of them in terms of durability and stability. Yet, while some infrastructures in mass digitization, such as cables and servers, are fairly solid and rigid constructions, others, such as semantic links, time-limited contracts, and research projects, are more contingent entities. Indeed, Google Books has proved to be such a contingent infrastructure. So when I started out, I was working in North Carolina at Durham, at Duke University, and the supervisor I had there, when I said that I was going to be working on Google Books in Europeana, suggested that I should historicize Europeana because EU was probably going to go bust soon. So she was not quite wrong, but for her, the idea of a Europeana going bust was easier to imagine than Google Books. But indeed, Google Books, during my time of writing, suddenly the Twitter feed stopped feeding and the blogs closed down, and then you heard that they stopped scanning altogether. Shadow libraries are other examples of such contingent infrastructures. This is lib.ru, initiated by the Russian professor in computer science, Maxim Moshko. This is Monoscope, where I am hosted, which is an amazing knowledge infrastructure. And this is UbuWeb, which is also a great example of some of the politics, and I look at that in my book, the politics connected to mass digitization projects. So I'll conclude by saying that understanding mass digitization projects, such as infrapolitical phenomena, helps us understand the ways in which cultural memory meets and conditions us. Indeed, it offers us inroads into thinking about not only the hows, but also the whys of mass digitization, here on the how information is put online in responsible ways. So this is something that scholars are increasingly looking into. Instead of only saying we need to digitize everything at mass and at speed, at scale, we're also now starting to look at what are the implications of doing this. So this is a wonderful article by Chelsea Juliet Rowell and Taryn Cooksey on digitizing the Kkk archives. Another example is Mukurtu project, which was piloted by the Warramungo Aboriginal community and tailored specifically to their needs in collaboration with Kim Kristen. Another is the Digitization project, a British Columbia-based collaborative initiative between indigenous communities and organizations. Kayama Glover from Columbia University, who's an amazing scholar, also offers us a good inroad into thinking how thoughtful digitization projects can appear with the early Caribbean digital archive. And moreover, we also see increased acts of intervention at the infrastructural level. For instance, the artistic interventions of Nora Al-Badri and Jan Nicolai Nilles, who hacked the database of Neues Museum Berlin to liberate Nefertiti's head and return it to the place it was found. So here we see it buried in the desert. Or Mimi Onuoha, oh, there's a comma too much. Mimi Onuoha, who created the Library of Missing Data Sets, which is a physical repository of those things that have been excluded in a society where so much is collected. So I leave you then just with a few concluding words, that if the power of mass digitization happens at the level of infrastructure, political responsibility will have to take that form as well, infrastructural intervention. So I opened my talk by claiming that the notion of mass digitization has shifted from a professional, technical concept to a cultural phenomenon. So if the former denotes a technical way of duplicating analog material in digital form, mass digitization as a cultural practice is a much more complex apparatus. On the one hand, it offers the simple promise of heightened public and private access to and better preservation of the past. On the other, it raises significant political questions about ethics, politics, power, and care in the digital sphere. So I locate the emergence of these questions within the infrastructures of mass digitization and the ways in which they not only offer new ways of reading, viewing, and structuring cultural material, but also new models of value and its extraction and new infrastructures of control. So the political dynamic of this restructuring, I suggest, may meaningfully be referred to as a form of infrapolitics, insofar as the political work of mass digitization often happens at the level of infrastructure. So I would rather paraphrase Catherine Hale's in delineating or outlining how we can understand these projects. And Catherine Hale's is suggested about something else, but I'll borrow it to this. That mass digitization, like a Janus figure, looks to the past and the future, simultaneously reinforcing and undermining both. So we play a role in the formulation of the ethics of mass digitization as it unfolds in these intimate knowledge economies and ecologies. And as such, we have to be willing not only to become acquainted with the history of the tools we've developed into crucial infrastructures, but also perhaps to abandon the predominant tropes of scale, access, and acceleration in mass digitization in favor instead of an infrapolitics of care that offers opportunity for mindful, slow, and focused encounters. And finally, to consider the correlation between scale and care and whether these can be meaningfully reconciled in the digital sphere. Thank you so much.
Thank you for an interesting lecture. You started out in the US with Google and those examples. I wonder, I have a feeling that we have a different tradition in Scandinavia, where we sort of have a counter library tradition compared to what's going on in the US especially. I wonder if you can say something about those differences between the US culture and the Scandinavian.
Could you explain what you mean by counter library culture?
You know, like Google was all about digitize before you ask for permission.
Yes.
It seems like the Scandinavian model is all about, you know, getting all the permissions in order first and then see what.
Yes. Yeah. So actually in my book, so thank you for that question. So in my book, I look at the reason why I look at three different kinds. So I look at Google Books, and then I look at Europeana, and then I look at shadow libraries. And so in them, I see three different sort of licit or illicit strategies. So Google was quite spectacular in its announcement of Google Books, and it was very much a do first and then see what happens afterwards. Also with massive backlash, we might say, right? So one of the reasons why it started dwindling is also because of the pushback. Whereas Europeana, when I did a lot of a field study in the European Commission and with the people who were charged with copyright questions. And so there, very early on, I got the sense that this was going to be difficult because when you visit the people, for instance, in the DG for culture, the film heritage department, so they're always played in these remote offices, like Jacques Tati would have had a field trip in the bureaucratic buildings they reside in. It's quite far from the center. And then the people in the DG copyright have flashy buildings. And so there you already saw the economies at play in making something like Europeana actually work across even the fragmented copyright landscape of Europe. But they still adhere to abiding the copyright regulations that exist, and then they work using mass digitization as a lever to argue that we need to change copyright in Europe. And then I look at shadow libraries, which are interesting because they in a way leverage the cultural economy. So I look at Hito Steele and her work on poor images. And so what many of these shadow libraries indeed harness is that many of these works don't have a massive economy, or they have a much more complex economy. And so the reason why they're able to exist is sometimes even in collaboration with. So they're not illegal, and that's my claim. So they're illicit, but they're not necessarily illegal, all of them anyway. And so Le Brou is interesting because it even received funding from the Russian state to create that library. But also, I mean, I know a lot of people who use Monoscope and even leak their own books to I did not, but leak their own books to Monoscope because they know that it increases circulation. So a different kind of economy.
Other questions, comments? Last one goes to Scott Member.
I was wondering about the concept of not just shadow libraries but dark archives, and I was wondering specifically when you say Google's approach is dwindling, not to be conspiratorial, but whether they're just sort of continuing, but in a dark archive. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that whole idea of the dark archive.
Yeah, yeah. I love the idea of a dark archive. But so my understanding is that, and I mean, it took me a long time to get access to Google. So I could talk to people who worked with Google in university settings. And then I had to sign non-DNA agreements, so I couldn't publicize anything of what they said because they had also signed NDA. But my understanding is that they have actually stopped scanning largely, and so what they do is at a much slower level. And so my reading of it is also perhaps much more in the sense of like this disruption of something, like we do it and we do it fast, and then suddenly, oh, it was too difficult, and then okay, we leave it, and then what happens to the infrastructure? And so to me, I don't know if the conspiracy would be located at the level of dark archives. At the same time, however, then they're shifting their strategies towards some. So we were talking yesterday about plant archives, for instance, right? A natural history material, if we might still use that dichotomy. And I think that there's definitely a lot of things going on that could be dark archive conceptualized, but Google Books itself, as far as I know, has actually slowed down its scanning activities. You might know otherwise, but yeah.
Tusen takk, Nanna.
Thank you so much.